Hi, everyone. Welcome to Smart City Institute Japan's webinar series, Global Perspective on Smart Cities. I'm Tak Nagumo, Executive Director of the Smart City Institute Japan, your host today. Today, we have a second session with Eden Strategy Institute from Singapore. And our title today is Smart City Innovations in Financing, Privacy Protection, and Inclusivity. Let's invite our distinguished speaker today, Ms. Rachel Tan. So Rachel, come in.
Hi, hello everyone.
Hi, thank you for joining me today. It's the second round.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Right. And last time we talked about smart city government ranking and climate neutrality, which are very important topic. But today, I think we are spicing up a little bit to more sensitive in part everyone is curious about, right? Financing is kind of missing piece. And privacy protection is always a matter of concern, particularly of the citizens, and the inclusivity. It's a kind of a, must item on the list, particularly with the use of the digital technology today. So yeah. I'm pretty much curious about what I can learn from you today.
Yeah, I think we are also very excited to share what we have found. And definitely, I think the past year, these couple of topics have risen up the agenda for many smart city governments. It's been coming up in a lot of conversations, particularly with the pandemic accelerating a lot of developments in this space. So yeah, hopefully, can share a couple of good insights with the audience and with you as well.
Thank you. And before we begin, just a housekeeping message to the audiences. So please feel free to write message questions to Rachel through the channel. But when you write, please choose all panelists and the participants with the pull-down menu for the messaging. That way we can share all the writings with all participants today. And after we hear from Rachel, we'll open a discussion time, maybe half an hour or so first, to cover your questions, okay? All right, Rachel, your show time.
Okay, give me a second to just pull up my screen. Okay. Okay, I have my Eden smart background, especially for these topics. All right. So, okay, please let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, just need to adjust it a little bit. All right, is that good?
Good, looks good.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tak, for the warm welcome and the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here today. And for those of you who are meeting me for the first time, hello, my name is Rachel, and I'm the co-lead investigator for Eden Strategy Institute's Top 50 Smart City Governments Ranking publication. And this is a publication that we came up with early on in 2018. And we published the second iteration of that of this ranking earlier this year. So in this webinar today, as Tak mentioned, I covered a bit about our rankings, the background behind it, the rationale, and some of our key findings in the previous session. So I think you can access that on their YouTube channel. But for today, I want to talk about specifically 3 topics that we touched on in our publication, which is smart city financing, the issues of data privacy and security concerns, and also building inclusivity in smart cities. So I'll be delving a bit deeper into these topics in today's session. But first of all, let me give you a brief introduction to my company, Eden Strategy Institute. So we are a strategy consulting firm that's based in Singapore, and we specialize in what we call business systems innovation. So what this means is that we work very closely with organizations across the globe to help them come up with strategies that can create economic value from solving big societal challenges. Because it is part of our core belief that companies and businesses cannot create profit at the expense of society, but rather should create profit from providing value to society. So we have, the work that we do spans many different types of stakeholders. Our clients include many government agencies across the world. We work with multilateral organizations like the UN. We also work with private corporations, social enterprises, and nonprofit organizations. And the types of work that we do for these organizations, they span from coming up with business models, developing products to go to market. We also help them to create blueprints, industry blueprints and sector roadmaps. We also do co-creation workshops and forecasting the impact of policy interventions. So there's a whole spectrum of service lines that we have for these companies. And we do this across many different industry verticals. So we have specializations in the healthcare sector, in education, in social enterprises, and most recently in smart cities as well. So as part of our smart cities practice, we came up with this top 50 smart city governments ranking. And just to give you a bit of background behind it, what we did for this particular publication was to look at hundreds of cities across the world and to assess them and sort of benchmark them across 10 different parameters on how the governments in these cities are performing. So back in 2018, we realized that there were many cities that were coming to us, asking us for advice on how to build a smart city. And at that point, we, trying to help them solve the issue, we figured that the first thing we needed to do was to have an objective basis to compare and understand what makes a well-functioning city. And we found that there's actually no shortage of smart city rankings across the globe, right? But to us, it was a bit unfair to compare different cities to each other. For example, to say, whether Singapore is better or whether Jakarta is better or London is better, because each of these cities have their own histories, their own geographical context, and their own culture. So what is necessary or needed for one city may not necessarily apply to another city. So that is why we decided to use and to look at smart city governments instead of looking at the cities themselves when we want to compare the performance across different smart cities. Because the governments are actually the center of decision-making in the city. They have a lot of autonomy over where the funds are going, what initiatives are being implemented, and so on. So that is why we came up with the only smart city governments ranking in the world. So this was our 2018 publication, where, as I mentioned, we looked at hundreds of cities around the world. We studied them in detail, and we ranked them according to the 10 different parameters, ranging from the strategy of the government to the budgets that they allocated to it, to whatever innovation ecosystem they had, their talent development programs, and a couple of other parameters. And in 2021, so this year, we did the same, we used the same methodology, but we studied a wider range of cities this time. So we had about 230 cities that we studied. We also issued a call for proposals. So we sent out survey forms to the city governments to make sure that we collected a full suite of information from them that would help us in our rankings. And we also interviewed a couple of city mayors and smart city practitioners to get additional insights to support our ranking. And as part of our rankings, it's not only a list of the top 50. We also have what we call city stories within our publication, where we really dive deep into the innovative best practices that these cities have employed, so that whoever picks our publication, be it a smart city practitioner or a government official, they're able to learn from the best practices of other cities as well, because governments, they also need help in learning how they can develop a coherent strategy, how to budget funds, how to build an innovation ecosystem, and so on. So that's the main idea behind our publications. And yeah, so for this particular year, we had a special feature articles covering a range of different themes. So these are the topics that Tak was mentioning earlier are becoming a lot more pertinent in our smart city conversations over the past year or so. And in today's session in particular, I would like to cover the topics of smart city financing, of data privacy and protection, and also around building inclusive smart cities. And before I dive into those topics first, I'd just like to establish a bit of our own personal house position on what smart cities are. Because the topic of smart city is something that has been coming up in a lot of conversations, and the word smart has been thrown around so much that it sometimes gets a bit blurred what it truly means. And for Eden, the way that we view smart cities is we believe that it has to go beyond just technology. And a lot of the times, the word smart has a connotation of technology around it and data. But to us, a smart city is something, it's a city that is able to it is sustainable, it is inclusive, it is safe, and it is lovable. And we think that smart cities are the ones that are able to bring both technology and also other non-technical aspects into their planning and policy. For example, engaging with stakeholders, having thoughtful policies, having forward-looking plans, and also involving their citizens in decision-making processes. So just to give you a flavor of how we view the whole smart cities space, and also in the way that we rank and our cities. So for more information on the exact cities in the top 50, you can visit our website, which is smartcitygovt.com. So we have the full list of the top 50 cities in there, and also we're very transparent with the methodology we use. So you can go there and learn a bit more about how we did our entire ranking. So now I'd like to delve into the first topic, which is creative models around smart city financing. And this is a very important topic because to build smart cities requires a lot of capital investment. There's a lot of capital that's required to buy technological solutions, or to build new buildings, or to spruce up existing infrastructure. And there are many estimates of how much funding is required to fill in the infrastructure funding gap globally, ranging from $1 trillion USD to 15 trillion USD. And in Asia alone, the Asian Development Bank estimated that about 90% of the infrastructure expenditure is currently funded by the government, which is definitely unsustainable in the long run, because the governments, they don't have unlimited source of funding, and they also have to fund additional things. And I mean, they also have to take care of people's welfare and create jobs and all that. So a lot of the funding has to come from alternative sources. With the COVID-19 pandemic, cities are facing also increasing pressure in the way that they allocate funds, because we see countries from the US to Europe, the UK, the governments have to inject a lot of money to revive the economy, because people are out of jobs and the economy has stalled, right, because of all these restrictions around movement and working. So the issue of funding is becoming a lot more important right now, and is very critical that city governments are aware of the different types of funding that they can access. So I'd just like to share a couple of examples of where these funds can come from. One of them would be the most straightforward way is to leverage federal grants. So for example, we've seen in Thailand and Australia, they actually have, the cities in these countries are actually able to tap on the national federal funds that which are basically grants that are given for initiatives that promote livable, sustainable, and more productive cities. So federal funding is one of the main sources of funding for many smart city governments, especially in developed countries where your federal governments do have an allocated budget for smart city projects. But what we find is that it is a bit more difficult for poorer nations to access large amounts of federal funding, simply because the national government does not have that much money that's available, right, to fund infrastructure projects, and certainly not budgets that are just allocated for smart city projects. So there's still significant investment that's required to close this infrastructure gap. So especially in developing nations where more and more people are moving from rural to urban regions. So your development in the urban spaces is a lot faster, and there's a lot more infrastructural needs in these urban spaces, right? And a lot more funding that's required to flow in. So there's very little chance that the governments can close this gap if they keep funding infrastructure projects as they have in the past, which is mainly through public funds. So we see that, in this current situation, in many economies where there are government deficits, where there's increased public debt to GDP ratios, and there's, difficulties in delivering on effective, efficient investment spending, it has forced public officials to reduce the amount of funds that they allocate to infrastructure. So this means that governments have to look to alternative sources of funding. And one of them is through public-private partnership models. So essentially, in these kinds of models, it involves the public sector, which is the government, putting in a certain amount of money, and also getting private sectors and players in to invest in some of these infrastructural needs. So in these types of partnerships, there definitely has to be, first of all, a good business case for private companies to want to come and invest their capital. So it cannot just be, the government is issuing a tender for private companies to come in and invest, but actually there's no potential return on investment for these infrastructure solutions. So what cities are doing, which is quite interesting, is that they are positioning a lot of these infrastructural funding gaps as an investment opportunity for the private sector. So we see a couple of examples. One of them is in Vienna, in Austria, where the city they wanted to develop an energy efficiency demonstration project. So they roped in Siemens and some of Vienna's key energy providers, as well as its business agency and a property developer, to invest in this project for energy efficiency in around certain buildings. And the aim of it was that once the project is completed, the revenues from the rental and the sale of the offices, the apartments, and the retail space will be split across the different parties involved. So there is a business case for all the parties involved, and therefore an incentive for them to participate and invest in this infrastructure or this project. Another one is in Bristol. We see that actually Bristol is one of the greenest cities in the UK. So they invest a lot in clean energy and in reducing their carbon footprint. So they launched this program to attract private investment to fund various aspects of their city's energy transition. They expect around, I think, £1 billion that's needed for this transition to occur. And of course, they are very aware that the government itself cannot fund the full $1 billion. So they have said upfront that they are willing to invest in some of these projects, but a majority of the funds will have to come from private investment. And so they position a lot of the investment opportunities to private companies in areas such as building new heat networks, or building smart energy systems, or monitoring and evaluation of the data that they collect. And so there are many of these opportunities in these spaces that can attract private investments and private investors to come into the city. And sometimes cities may just want to get private sector capital. They may not even want to do it in a partnership type of model. For example, we see in Shandong in China, Siemens Financial Services, they came in and they funded a green bus deal worth almost 15 million USD, which allowed a local public bus operator to invest in hundreds of hybrid and electric buses. So basically, they had a private investor come in, put in money, sort of as an asset investment to enable the local bus operator to transition to a cleaner cleaner mode of transport. And in Bandung, this is a very interesting case. We saw that the city actually made corporate social responsibility, or CSR, contributions mandatory for any company that's operating within the city. So this is sort of is sending out a message to the companies in the city, right? To say that, okay, if you want to operate in my city, you have to contribute to social development here. And because of this, the city actually managed to raise about 2.3 million worth of CSR funding that supported almost 200 different smart city activities in the city. So this is quite an innovative way of getting and accessing private sector capital. It could be through having a very, very good business case for the private companies to come in and to reap any kinds of returns of investments that they make from their investments, or also by creating special policies or regulations that say that if you want to operate in my jurisdiction, you have to contribute in some way back to the development of the city. But aside from federal funding and private or public-private types of collaborations, there is also funding from multilateral organizations. And this is perhaps one of the most important types of funding, especially for developing nations, because the previous types of funding that I mentioned, including private investment, it is very difficult for developing countries to access that kind of funding because there is a lot of risk involved in going into a developing nation, right? There's risk of political instability, there's risk of poor infrastructure to begin with, there's risk of war or invasions. And so it is hard to attract private investors or companies to come in, to pump in money into a city where sometimes the government is not functioning well, or there's very little potential for growth. So this is where multilateral organizations come in. And these organizations include like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the European Union, which have specific funds and loans that are set aside to help advance and uplift cities' economies. And the key benefit of having these multilateral organizations is the risk mitigation that I talked about. So all those risks to do with developing nations or nations that are prone to natural disasters, or they have ongoing conflict, these multilateral organizations come in, and what they do is that they offer concessional finance products. So they can offer, for example, low interest loans to the cities. They can put in equity investments, or they can be credit guarantors for other private investors who are looking to come in. So what I mean is that they can act as a guarantor in case of any kinds of credit default. They will pay out the loan back to these private investors. So one of the examples we see is in a city called Mariupol in Ukraine. And as you may know, Ukraine is facing some conflict with Russia at the moment, and has been ongoing for many, many years. So it's hard to get investors into the city. And what the Mariupol managed to do was that they acquired funding from the International Finance Corporation to fund its transport system, to greenify the transport system. Another city that we saw benefit from multilateral organizational funding was Barcelona. So Barcelona's case is a little bit different because it's part of the European Union, and it's funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 project. So it actually benefits from being part of the EU countries. It is backed by a lot of countries' capital, and the EU itself has a lot of development plans for Europe. So being part of the EU also has its benefits, right? In that it can access this kind of capital. And so, it managed to obtain some funding for its Do It program. So it's a program that aims to pilot innovation labs and maker spaces in schools to help to build innovation capabilities among the young. And finally, one of the most creative ways that cities can source funding is through innovative business models. In this case, it is not about getting funding from outside. It's not about getting funding from the government itself, but it's more about looking at how your existing infrastructure or your existing solutions can be self-sustaining by generating revenue themselves. And what I mean by that is, for example, right, we see in Philadelphia and also in New York City that the government is leveraging smart display kiosks, which are actually built in the city to provide free Wi-Fi for citizens. But what the city government has done is to repurpose the kiosk and use the display that is part of the Wi-Fi booth as advertising space. So they would sell it to private companies and obtain revenue from the advertising space on their displays. And this will help to continue, funding, it will help to fund the operation and the maintenance of these kiosks rather than draw directly from public funds. And in Oslo, which is the EV capital of the world, we saw that the city actually introduced semi-fast vehicle charging stations as a paid service. So they actually have another version of it, which is just the regular vehicle charging station, which is free for citizens. But in order to recoup some of that cost, they introduced this premium option where citizens can get their vehicles charged at a much faster rate, but then they also have to pay for it. So the revenues collected would then continue financing the expansion of its charging infrastructure. So these are some very interesting ways that we see governments making use of their existing infrastructure and offering new business models to generate revenue, to make all these investments a bit more self-sustaining. Some other ways that we have seen governments create revenue from their existing infrastructure is by monetizing environmental and social performance data collected from their smart lightings, their smart traffic lights, and smart buildings. But this is also a bit tricky because the data collected has to be balanced with careful considerations of privacy and cybersecurity risks as well. But there's also another way, right? The data that they collect is actually very valuable, and governments are also thinking of ways how they can repurpose this data to monetize it and to get revenue from it. Yeah, so I guess those are just a couple of examples around different ways that cities can get funding for their smart city projects. And this last thing that I talked about around the issues of data collection and privacy is actually a good segue into the next topic, which is privacy and security concerns in smart cities. So at this point in time, the world has never been more interconnected, and our reliance on the internet has never been greater. And this means that we are actually very vulnerable to things like cyber attacks, to ransomware attacks, which have been coming up quite often recently, and also data breaches. And we may wonder, why is it that these poses a threat to the nation or to individuals? Well, I mean, with a lot of large troves of anonymized data, actually terrorists can gain a lot of insight into a country's strategy, its budget, its finances, and its resources. So they can use it against a nation quite easily, which is why a lot of city governments are now investing a lot into cyber security defense and strengthening their own cyber infrastructure. Some of the ways that we see cities trying to mitigate this issue is by, first of all, making sure that they have a strong commitment to data protection across the city governments and their employees, and to create norms around protecting data privacy. So Seattle was one of the first cities to establish this role called the Chief Privacy Officer, which operates under one of its information technology departments. And it has the responsibility of managing the city's data protection policies. And on top of that, they also passed a resolution that indicated privacy as a human right, to drive home the message that data protection is really one of the core priorities for the city. And in Dubai, we saw was one of the first Middle Eastern cities to pass a comprehensive data protection law. And many cities across the world have now passed comprehensive data protection laws, but one of the key features of Dubai's law is that it guarantees the right to individual privacy and calls for the anonymization of personal data if it were to be shared. So there are a couple of ways that governments are trying to enforce data protection, and one of them is through passing policies and establishing personal responsibilities in their departments, so that there's an actual framework and a structure for making sure that these policies are being implemented across the city. A second way is that governments are dealing with the issue of data breaches and potential data concerns is by test bidding and pilot trialing some of the data innovations in the city. So city governments, they do struggle with managing and anticipating the full consequences of their technology investments and their reliance. And so some of them have started to collaborate with the private sector to exchange ideas, to experiment, to innovate, and to identify potential risks around some of their initiatives before they formulate policies and regulations. For example, in Portugal, there's a city called Porto, which launched a test bid for the use cases of data from its sensor technologies. So it will part of the test bid involve monitoring the use cases where data is being collected for surveillance, for motion detection, for temperature and humidity, and so on. And they will also test out, how strong is the data anonymization, how strong is the multi-party computation and their privacy-preserving techniques to anticipate any kinds of issues before they rolled out the sensor network to the whole city. And in Sydney, in Australia, they have this thing called security by design, which is a principle that was first introduced in the UK a couple of years back. And in the UK, what they meant by security by design was designing consumer goods with the idea of data protection at the outset. So in the initial design should already incorporate measures to prevent data breaches and hacks and so on. But in Australia, they took this principle and they applied it to their policies instead. So basically what they did was before they design any policies around open data, they will make sure that it is aligned with several key principles in an identity management model that they use. And some of these principles will involve checkability of the data, choice, control, and convenience. So essentially, they would make sure that from the outset, the policy itself is already designed to have security as top of mind. And lastly, I think one of the most important features of privacy and data concerns in this day and age is also the need to create trust through citizen engagement and transparency. And actually, it is a very key. It is a very important part of the whole governance process to engage citizens and to make sure that there's buy-in to any kinds of data solutions that the government is proposing. For example, in Tallinn, in Estonia, which is the digital capital of the world, where a lot of the services have been digitalized and integrated, the government introduced this thing called the Personal Data Usage Monitor. So this is an open source software where every time a resident's data has been accessed, it is logged on a record. These logs are time-stamped and they're digitally signed. They cannot be tampered with. And residents are, they can access this log anytime to check for how their data is being used. And similarly, in the city of Amsterdam, citizens are also provided with this digital portal where they can access their personal data and even give feedback on how their data is being used. So it is very important that governments are able to get the buy-in of their citizens to and gain their trust, right, that the data is being used in the right ways. Because if not, then there's a lot of repercussions of what the government can do. Because for the government, there's no license to operate, so to speak, and it's very difficult for them to implement new initiatives if the citizens don't have trust in what they're doing with the data. For example, the very well-known case of the Sidewalks Lab in Toronto, which was supposed to be a project that was very data heavy, where there would be a lot of sensors to track the way that people were moving, sensors that will control street lighting and temperatures and the sidewalks and stuff and all that. But it faced a lot of public criticism because there was opacity around where the data was going. People were resigning from the boards because they didn't trust what the government was doing with data and so on. So this is a critical part of building a very cohesive data policy. So engaging the people and making sure that there's transparency in where the data is going. And this brings me nicely to the last topic that I would like to talk about today, which is around building inclusive smart cities. The World Economic Forum actually listed the erosion of social capital as one of the greatest short-term threats to the world, in the 4th place after climate action failure, after infectious diseases, after livelihood crisis. So especially in the past year, cities have been increasingly tested because of the global pandemic, which has triggered many, many instances of social unrest across the globe, because people are unhappy with the way that, with government policies, with inequitable distribution of resources, and because of racial tensions that are more apparent because of the pandemic. So one of the ways to develop a greater sense of cohesion within cities is through technological tools. And technology is itself a key part of smart cities, right? But there are many ways that technology can be used to make the cities more inclusive as well. So in San Francisco, we saw that there was a very interesting initiative by the one of the housing departments to make sure that their housing portal, which is where people will go in to rent their apartments, to search for apartments, to pay their mortgages and all that, to make sure that this was accessible to all their residents. And so what they did was to conduct very extensive user testing. So they interviewed people with disabilities, people of all kinds of races, people with HIV and AIDS, the youth and the elderly, to get a sense of what they needed so that they could make the housing portal a lot more accessible and eventually, democratize housing access. So, when you go to their website, you can see immediately that there are multiple languages available for you to select, and the instructions are extremely clear and straightforward. And so this is just a very simple but important way, right, that you help your citizens get more access to digital services. And Singapore as well also has a very interesting example of really ground-up initiatives to include people in the digital movement, because many cities are moving towards being a smart city, right? Which means being more digitalized and having to use technology more and more in everyday life. So a big part of or core group of citizens that are being left out are the seniors and elderly. And so Singapore, I think this year or late last year, actually posted job openings for digital ambassadors, which are people who are hired to go down to the ground into grassroots areas, into our hawker centers, into neighborhood centers as well, to speak to the elderly, especially hawkers who are selling their food at food stalls, and teach them how to use digital payment systems, especially during COVID, because government is trying to minimize contact between people. And then there's also the redesigning of physical spaces. So apart from technology itself, the physical space that we are in often dictates the way that we behave as a community. And there's a very often cited example of this Danish urbanist who found that people actually walk more quickly on sidewalks where there are blank building facades than they do for those with first floor windows, right? Because people actually spend time looking into the shops or looking into windows, and therefore they spend more time mingling around. So the way that cities are designed is also a very important way of building for community spirit and making sure that different services are accessible to people. So in Bogota, for example, because social exclusion often occurs along gender lines, because women sometimes feel like they don't feel safe to be out in public spaces. What the city did was that they conducted a participatory audit of public spaces where they collaborated with this map-based app to collect information around which parts of the city people felt the most unsafe in. And they came up with a couple of different factors that affected the perceptions of safety in cities. For example, the amount of lighting that's available, the number of people around, the proximity to public transport. And this actually helped to help them make spaces that feel a lot safer to the women in the city. In Miami, in the US, there is a very interesting project that's going on, which is, they call it the Underline. So this is actually like a 42-kilometer stretch of road that sits under its train tracks. So it runs through more than a dozen different neighborhoods, and it connects the communities that are near this track. And the aim of this entire development is to bring different communities together, whether you're old or young, or whether you can drive or you cannot drive. And so there's a lot of free activities that's going on. There's yoga classes, there's music performances, there's gardens, and there's gyms, and there's tennis courts. So people can mingle in those spaces. And even those that cannot drive, they're able to walk nearby. So this is an example of how public spaces can be designed to be more inclusive, and also to provide avenues for people to have meaningful social connections, right? Because it's not just about bumping into each other, but actually in that limited interaction that you have, are you able to have a quality conversation with your community, people in your community? And lastly, this is a very low-tech solution, but one of the best ways to facilitate and build inclusive cities is to make sure that you have citizen engagement, so that people feel like they have a say in the way that the city is developing, and that they are concerned with the betterment of the city. So we see in Lublin in Poland, and also in Barcelona, there are different channels that the government is launching to enable people to give feedback on different government policies. And so these are just very simple ways. It could be either through a mobile app to get people's feedback, or it could be through giving incentives to people who give their feedback. But as long as people feel that they are engaged and that the decisions are decentralized and not really made in the hands of just a few people, that they are more willing to be engaged in the development of the city, and they are more willing to support the government's initiatives. So these are what I've just talked about, the past three topics. They are all very different topics, but essentially the principle behind what I'm trying to share is the same, which is that there are many different ways of approaching each of these topics, and there's no fixed cut and dried way or solution to building a smart city. And it really depends on the context of the city and what is necessary for the city that would make a successful smart city initiative. So the aim of this entire sharing is to really expose city governments or smart city practitioners to different ways that things are being done out there. And hopefully this will inform on the city's policies, and they can, pick and choose what is it that works best for them. So yeah, I've come to the end of my sharing, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments from the audience right now.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. It looked like we completed the mini world tour. It's full of ideas and practices collected around the world. Thank you very much. All right, and then now for the audience, now we are open to question, comments, but please write in English. Since we are using English as a common language here, right? And before moving on to questions from the audience, I would like to open up with my questions first, right? And for the financial sections, yeah, this is full of the tools and the venues we can utilize. And to be honest with you, we as Japanese smart city practitioners are wondering, which one best fits to the smart city models, because each one of the items are short of something, right? Let's say government funding is very useful at the beginning, but it's not permanent, only for the beginning, right? Then later on, the city must be self-running. They should be financing by themselves and monetizing business for permanent, operations.
Mm-hmm.
So after the initial phase, the cities must find its own way of monetizing and financing situation, but we don't really have a clear answer to it. With some ideas, just like you mentioned, PPP or the private companies spending their money for their piece and so forth. And what I found interesting is the case of bundle. Once you are coming to the city, you really have to contribute as part of the corporate social responsibility, right? So it's like an entry fee to the city.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was wondering if it's the one-shot game, or as long as the company operate in the city, they have to keep paying, like just like a tax payment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea about how the payment should be arranged?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting model for sure, but whether or not it works in across cities around the world, I think is another question. Sometimes if it depends on the amount of the tax as well, right? If you can think of it as a tax on the company. If it is too low, then the city may not be able to recoup enough funds to cover its cost. But if it's too high, then you might price out some of these companies who may not want to work in places like high tax environments. So I think this model, it has to balance what is the kind of companies it's trying to attract. Are they able to stomach this kind of corporate social responsibility tax? And are they at risk of pricing out some of the companies that can actually contribute to developing smart city solutions for the city? So I think it also depends, really depends on the types of companies that the city is trying to attract.
Okay. I think there's a room for improvement or room for enhance the idea from this abundance case. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Japanese cities, obviously the population is not growing. It's aging in addition to just decreasing. And the economy is a little bit of deflationary rather than inflationary, which means that tax revenue for the city council is decreasing going forward. But if companies are willing to pay something extra in return for using the city as a field for their business, then it's kind of a reliable source of funding. So I think if the company is willing to live and work and how do you say share the fortune with the city, they can pay a little bit of extra money, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if this is actually implemented more prevalently across the world, then it becomes a norm, right? So whichever city you go to, you're expected to pay a certain amount to contribute back to the development of the city, then I think it is more likely to be successful, because then the companies, they don't really have other options. Like they cannot choose to go somewhere else where they don't have to pay it. Yeah.
Good idea. And yeah, I had a lot of writing. Privacy part is also kind of a headache part, because no one wants to use his or her own data for business, but they want to use someone else's data. Right? So it's a prisoner's dilemma situation. And the most important part is building trust. Okay, I give you my data for you, and you give me your data. So collectively, we should be better off. That's the kind of fundamental idea supporting the trust, right? If we trust each other, you can come up with a trust sum game. And interesting reality is that Japan is a low trust country amongst almost all countries in the world. When I saw the data, I was a little shocked about that, because we are the quality country, quality orientation, and we trust our products, and we welcome people from any parts of the world. So omotenashi, that's a keyword we used to invite our Olympic Games to Tokyo, right? But in reality, there's a concept of the inside and outside. So we trust people within the community or within the family members, but outside, we tend to be not to trust. We don't betray, but we don't trust outsiders, which turned out to be a disadvantage in the age of the digitalization. So it was an unexpected outcome of our cultural trait.
Yeah.
And how you overcome the cultural trait is a kind of key challenge Japan has faced right now. What's the situation in Singapore?
Yeah, I guess I'm also a bit surprised, like you, right, that the trust ratings are low in Japan, because I think Japan is known for the quality of its work and all that. So I would expect that the trust will be higher. In Singapore, we found that trust actually went up during the pandemic, especially trust towards the government and trust towards the public news outlets. It actually went up. And I think building trust, it is quite difficult. It's quite a difficult feat in any city. The government first has to prove itself to have a reliable track record, and then people can start to trust, right? But if it's something that is to do with the culture of the people and the way that they view the outside world, I think there's also a case to be made for governments to reposition what outsiders can do for the city, or what outsiders can do for the country, that would open up the trust and the willingness to collaborate with outsiders. Because if there's a good case to be made for what outside information or what outside collaboration can bring, and examples of that, then it's a lot easier for people to start trusting, I think.
I see. The one case you elaborated from the case of Estonia, which is something we already know and we like very much, the data usage monitoring. So you allow someone else to use your data, but who used it. There's a traceability of the data. So once you move on to the data world, then you really have to be secured by knowing who used your data. And it's the kind of system embedded into the data architecture in Estonia, which I think is a very interesting case. Do you have something similar in Singapore as well?
So at the moment, I don't think it's at the level where we can track exactly where our data is going. And I think there's still room for improvement in the way that our data is being managed. But I think Estonia is definitely one of the models that we follow. And during this pandemic also, we realized that the use of our data is quite contentious, especially because a lot of data is being collected for public health reasons, like where you're going, what time you're going there, and how often. And actually, in the I think about a couple of months back, there was a big controversy around what the Singapore government was planning to do with this data, because initially they said that it would not be used for criminal prosecution. But actually, then after that, they came in and said like, oh, if there's any kind of serious criminal cases, for example, like murder or terrorism activities, then they could use the data that they collected as part of this public health tracing app, right, to prosecute that person, which created a lot of uproar among citizens around, what their data is being used for. So I think we are still in quite a nascent stage of data ethics, and there's still a lot of room to firm up some of the policies around what data can or cannot be used for here in Singapore.
I see. Yeah, I think the situation is similar, and Japan is more conservative than Singapore as well. We do have a contact tracing app, but the number of the download is not rising up, and then whether or not you use it actually is in question. I downloaded it. My family members all downloaded it, but have we used it? I don't think so. So not because we are not trusting the Japanese government, but probably we are not trusting the use of technology yet. It's a matter of maturity. Once you are more getting used to, then you are more comfortable using that app for securing your data. And now I think once the data is away from you, it's almost like you are spending money from your wallet. But once it's gone, it's never come back.
You're right. Because data really is money. I think it is really expensive, to get this kind of information, and people are willing to pay top dollar for that. But the thing is that the citizens themselves don't get to benefit from any of their data being sold, which is another problem, in the use of data by governments.
You're right. So, Rachel, let's look at the comments and the questions from the audience. I will read it for you. First one is Luis Kill. Thank you for sharing your definition of what makes a city smart. I agree that often the term smart is used without really understanding what it means. I support your definition as it puts people as a central focus. Yeah, I also agree with your definition. How did you come up with that definition? The reason why I ask you about this is that Japan is also implementing smart city in digital government. And the tendency is that people focus on technology first, not the people first. And of course, after massaging technology a little bit, people recognize that, okay, we are now talking about people first, people welfare, well-being, and then technology is just a means to the end. But initially, the technology geeks get into it, forget about the purpose. And looking around, the European countries, let's say, they're more conscious about human centrality, maybe after testing many things earlier than what we did. And, Singapore, I think you at least define this as a more human-centered definition, not a technology-centered definition. How did you come up with this, the nice definition?
I think it is quite easy to fall into the trap that technology is the answer to a smart city, because technology is quite sexy, right? You have all these data and AI and robots everywhere, and a lot of times in science fiction that's kind of depicted as the future of the city. But ultimately, we also recognize, like exactly what you said, that technology is just a means to serve the actual residents of the city, right, which are the people. And without the people, there is, what is the point of having the technology in the first place? So for us, it is, I guess, the human-centric lens is something that we apply not just in our smart cities practice as Eden, but also in all the other work that we do. It's really about meeting the needs of people on the ground, making sure that people are involved, and not just like a byproduct or like a sort of a afterthought, right? Technology in place.
So Rachel, I think you just mentioned participation as a kind of keyword. So probably, in the course of implementing smart city or technology, people recognize that people buy-in is a must item on the list. Otherwise, just inventing the technology doesn't make any sense at all. So, you need to have people engaged, participating in the decision of how the technology should be deployed. And then essentially human centricity kicks into the main stage. And you talked about the people participation, giving an example of the digital ambassadors program in Singapore, which I think is a fabulous idea. Is that a kind of a ubiquitous idea you can see everywhere in Singapore?
So this is, I think, one of the more grown-up initiatives we've seen in Singapore. And simply because when it comes to digital technology, we find that even if you provide incentives for the elderly to use it, they are not really attracted by the incentives because they simply just don't know how to use it, right? So even if we told the elderly hawkers who are the food sellers that if you use the digital payment system, you get, let's say, cash rebates, they actually don't do it because they don't know how to use it. So the people actually, the best way to go down to educate them, to show them exactly how it's done step by step, to help them practice using it. And I think it is a very good initiative by the Singapore government, because they have found that their other tactics are not as effective.
I see.
Yeah.
In case of Japan, we don't have an ambassador program, but we have something similar. Open data evangelist program, the practitioners of the open data, enlist as a volunteer to the government. The government appoints them as an evangelist. And once the regional government, requests support from the evangelist go actually there and support for a very little fee. It's almost a combination hybrid of the volunteer and the paid service.
I see. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it is quite, I mean, as much as we want to rely on artificial intelligence and things being automated, right? Sometimes you just cannot replace human intelligence and human communication skills. Especially when you're speaking to the old elderly generation, you cannot just get a robot to go down and teach them. I think the human aspect of it is still quite irreplaceable at this point.
Yeah, right. Okay, let's move on to the second question, comments from the audience. This is from Dario Tan. It's interesting that point of business partnership was brought about. In the case of Shandong, aside from the ESG aspect, what sort of economical advantages does it garner the fund from funding the green bus?
So I think that's a good question. If I'm not wrong, the business model that they had for this kind of partnership was that Siemens would get a cut of the revenue from the bus operations, because it's a public transport system, right? So people actually have to pay to use the buses. And so part of it would be to get a cut of the revenue, and also because they loaned the initial funds for the public bus operator to buy the electric vehicles. When they get the loan repayment, there's also an interest rate to that. So that's sort of the business model behind why they would finance this initiative.
Okay, so just a broad question, it kind of a stupid question, but what we tend to feel is that we cannot move forward with the pure market economy model. Too much competition, only the price determines everything type of stuff is not doable in the aging society where the economy is not growing. So sharing economy or the cooperative ideas or commons ideas, something sitting in the middle of the pure economy and pure government is becoming more important than ever. And it's a somewhat social democracy type of approach, similar to those ideas implemented in continental Europe or the Nordic European countries. What's the perspective your Singaporean people have upon the the society going forward with technology?
I think you're absolutely right in that it's becoming more of the dichotomy is sort of closing in. So it's not just entirely public run or entirely private run. There has to be some kind of like a shared model. But also there's, I think in Singapore, it is something that we are pursuing. So there's a lot of partnerships going on between the public sector and private sector. public sector is getting the private sector in, as a service provider in a lot of its major infrastructural services like bus operating, and other transport operating systems. But there's also challenges to do with that, right? For example, we see that in other places around the world, the governments are becoming increasingly cautious around what private companies are doing in their cities. Like in China, for example, the recent clampdown of the big tech companies like Alibaba, TT, right, who have amassed a ton of data from their citizens' movements. They are, instead of kind of working together with these private companies, they're actually trying to tone down the amount of power that they have in the city. So it's also showing that, sometimes when companies get too powerful, the governments may not necessarily feel safe to have them around or to feel safe having them operating in the city. And in that case, I think a very different kind of partnership model has to come up, in which the private company is able to show and demonstrate that it can handle the data ethically and to sort of win some of its power back to the government, and also for the government to trust, right, that the private companies are serving the cities well and are providing benefits for its citizens, for that kind of partnership to occur.
Yeah, I think Alibaba's case was an interesting case because, on surface, I tend to think that China is governed by the Communist Party, no one else. But, the Alibaba as a business is almost like an overriding power of the government.
Yeah.
So in the fear of the, overpower, government stepped in to slow down the Alibaba business.
Mm-hmm.
It's unthinkable, at least by impression in China. That's an interesting case.
Yeah.
All right. So the next question from Sato-san. Could you show the ranking list with today's 3 topics? I want to see what is common approach and what is the special features. I think Sato-san assumes that your topics today, finance, privacy protection, and inclusivity, have been ranked just like you ranked the smart city government. If it's the case, he would like to see how their ranking is. Did you rank those? Yeah.
So the rankings, the themes that we cover in our publication, they are not the parameters that we use for the rankings, but they are elements of that in our rankings. And you can actually download the full ranking list on our website. And within our website also, the Smart City Gov website, smartcitygovt.com. You can see each of the cities and their specific scores. So the themes that we talked about today are just a couple of special topics that we find to be more pertinent in today's smart city conversations. But we didn't rank it according to those topics.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think this is the last comments or question from Louise Kyo. Thank you, Rachel. These were all very insightful use cases. I'm particularly interested in the innovation commercial business models. Have you got any further use cases, examples of how these have actually come together? Often, when you have a unique commercial model, it can be hard to find the right people to speak to.
Yeah, that is a good question. So in the cases that I shared, I think I mentioned the smart kiosk and the advertising revenue model, and also the way that Bandung was getting its CSR contributions. Those definitely involve conversations outside of the public sector. So they have to tap into private sector partners as well. And you're right in that it is sometimes hard to get the right stakeholders to talk to. But in this case, it all hinges on having like a network of both public and private stakeholders in your contact list. So this is also why we are hoping that these sort of sharings or webinars are places where we create communities of smart city practitioners, both from the private sector and public sector, who can come together, just connect afterwards on LinkedIn or just within this chat box itself, to share what exactly they are doing and share some of the challenges that they are facing so that we can plug or match needs to solutions. So in those examples, to answer your questions, it is a blend of both of the government reaching out to different private sector players who can provide, let's say they have the example, they have the idea of creating this advertising revenue business model, to find the private sector players who are able to make the advertising displays and to run that kind of thing, and then then they can create like a running system. So first step is to have the connections in place first and to know who to speak to for a particular challenge, and then having that collaboration to make it work out.
Thank you very much. And last question from me, which is a kind of overarching question over 3 topics you talked about. And you gave us examples of cities: Vienna, Bristol, Shandong, Bandung, Barcelona, Oslo, Philadelphia, so forth. And I am always asking myself, what's the optimal size of the city from the population standpoint? If it's too big, I think it's very difficult to implement the idea, coordinate the people from different sectors. If it's too small, it lacks the kind of the muscle, funding or the people power, whatever, data amount, whatever, to implement the smart city technologies, right? So there's a optimal range of population from maybe 100,000 to 500,000, something like that. There's no science about it. Probably it's case by case. But what's the kind of impression about the optimal size of a population for implementing digital technology, typically in the smart cities?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting question and probably worth a whole research study on its own. The correlation between the size of the city and the success in implementing as of digital initiatives. I think I can't really give you an exact number, but I would say also, right, it's probably a city that's not too small that there's no economies of scale in whatever you are trying to implement, but also not too massive that it becomes difficult to govern and to enforce different kinds of policies. So it is probably somewhere like nice in the middle. I think Singapore is quite a good size. We have a population of about 5 to 6 million people on a very, very small island. So we are very densely populated, which makes it also quite easy to govern, right? Because your geographical space is smaller and the infrastructural investments would be slightly less. And it's also easier to have different zones where you can manage your city operations. So yeah, I can't really give you an exact number, but I would say not too big like in the tens or hundreds of millions, but also not too small like in the tens or hundreds of thousands.
Do you have any city you are particularly interested in?
I think Singapore, because I may be biased because I'm living in Singapore and I'm a Singaporean, but I think Singapore is a very interesting example of how a government can manage its people with very, very little resources, right? Because actually our only resource is the people. We don't have any kind of natural resources. And okay, maybe another one would be our geographical location. So we are quite central and there's a lot of trade that's going on. But other than that, we don't really have a lot of natural resources. So it is quite interesting to see how the government has actually managed to do well in gaining the trust of its people, in enforcing its policies, in creating economic prosperity for the city. So yeah, I think Singapore is an example. And also I think many developing countries in South America and in Africa, there are cities there that are doing extremely well as well. They are really going out of their way to develop the city, to invest in smart city initiatives, which I think will be very interesting to study too.
Okay, thank you very much. Rachel, I think we covered everything, and then we completed the 2 sessions we planned. Thank you very much for your contribution, collaboration. We learned a lot from you. Any final words from you?
No, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it is a pleasure really to share all these insights with all of you. Maybe one final thing, if I may, which is, so my team is also hosting a panel series on our smart city findings. So for those of you in the audience who is interested, we actually have an upcoming panel on the 22nd of July around the topic of carbon neutrality in cities. And this will be from 3 to 4 p.m. Singapore time. So we would like to invite you to follow our Facebook page or LinkedIn page, and then be updated on who the speakers are and the topics, and register as well. But yeah, I think it has been a great, I mean, I've had a great time today's session and last week's session as well. I think the audience have been asking a lot of really engaging questions. And, you know, as I mentioned just now, we are hoping to really create a community around our smart cities practice. So please feel free to, I mean, I would like to encourage all of us to maybe share our LinkedIn profiles or emails in the chat box. And then we can connect afterwards as well to continue some of these conversations.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, this concludes our webinar today. Kudo-san, your final words?
Yes. So Rachel, thank you very much for your great presentation this week and last week. I said it in opposite way, I'm sorry. And let me just quickly go through the presentation materials that I have, but maybe it's not on. So let me do it again. Just a minute, please. Yep. Can you see? So thank you for viewing today, and you will receive the questionnaires after the event. So we would appreciate if you could answer the questionnaires, and the programs of the webinars will be available on Smart City Institute Japan's Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And they're also posted on Smart City Institute Japan's website and PTX. And including today, the recorded videos or past videos can be viewed on Smart City Institute Japan's YouTube channel. And for the programs after today, you know, we don't have an English-only program until July 26th, Monday. And we invite Smart City from Philippines. And the following day, we have, you know, the guest speaker from SAP Labs Japan. And also in the beginning of August, we would have a WeGo from Seoul. And about Smart City Institute Japan, our number of membership is growing, and it is about 430 now. And you know, our global partner organizations includes, of course, Eden Strategy Institute in Singapore, and we have many more. So again, thank you for watching today, and please have a nice day. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Ta. Thanks, Kudo. Bye.